Between 1914 and 1917, the number of American millionaires jumped from 7,509 to 11,800, a 57% increase driven entirely by war profits. By the time World War I ended, at least 21,000 new millionaires and billionaires had been created. But when the war was over, those profits became debts that had to be collected. And the collection mechanism was another world war. Most people think World War II started because Hitler was evil and Germany wanted revenge. That's the story on the surface. But underneath, there was a debt crisis that made another war not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. The same banks that created 21,000 millionaires from World War I spent the next 2 decades engineering the conditions that would allow them to collect those debts. What you're about to hear isn't speculation. It's documented financial flows, institutional arrangements, and a pattern so clear that once you see it, you can't look at the 20th century the same way again. So the real question isn't whether World War II was caused by unpaid debts. The question is simpler and more disturbing. If bankers engineered one world war to collect debts from another, what does that mean about the conflicts happening right now? And if this pattern is still operating, what happens to ordinary people when the next collection cycle begins? On June 28, 1919, German representatives signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors at the palace outside Paris. History classes focus on Germany losing territory and being forced to accept guilt for the war. But the real weapon wasn't guilt. It was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause that established legal framework for reparations that would financially enslave Germany for generations. The final bill came to 132 billion gold marks. In 1920s money, that was about $33 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that's over $760 billion today. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire annual economic output in 1921 couldn't cover even 1 year of the required payments. The reparations represented 83% of Germany's total GDP. Imagine your mortgage payment being 83% of your annual income. You wouldn't be able to eat, let alone pay. But here's what almost no one understands about Versailles reparations. Germany was never expected to pay from its own resources. The entire system was designed as a circular debt machine from day one. Germany would borrow money from American banks. Germany would use that borrowed money to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France would use those reparation payments to pay their war debts back to the United States. The money would flow in a circle, and at every stage, bankers would extract fees, interest, and commissions. Morgan had perfected this model during World War I itself. Morgan acted as both banker and purchasing agent for the Allies. He would loan money to Britain and France, receive it back immediately when they spent it on American war materials, and collect commissions on every transaction. The same dollar could generate 3 separate profit streams: interest on the loan, commission on the purchase, and the markup on the goods sold. By 1917, American bankers had loaned the Allied powers nearly $3 billion, with an additional $6 billion committed to exports and war materials. That's more money than the entire GDP of most European nations at the time. Here's the beautiful part from a banker's perspective. Most of that money never actually left America. Treasury, which had borrowed from American banks. The European governments immediately spent that money buying weapons, food, and supplies from American companies, owned by the same wealthy families who owned the banks. The debt was real. The money was a bookkeeping entry that transferred wealth from taxpayers to the richest families in America. So when the war ended, Britain owed the United States over $4 billion. France owed more than $3 billion. These were nations that had entered the war as global powers and empires. They emerged as debtors. Meanwhile, the United States transformed from a debtor nation before the war to holding the world's largest gold reserves and the largest creditor position in history. Wall Street displaced London as the financial capital of the planet. And Europe, the historic heart of global finance, was drowning in debt to American creditors. The Dawes Plan of 1924 made the circular debt system official. Named after American banker Charles Dawes, the plan restructured German reparations and provided for massive American loans to stabilize the German economy. Morgan led a consortium that loaned Germany 800 million gold marks in the initial phase, but the loans came with conditions that effectively put Germany into financial receivership. American financial advisors would supervise German government spending. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, came under partial foreign control. German railways were pledged as collateral. Customs revenues were automatically diverted to pay creditors before the German government could use them for domestic programs. A sovereign nation that had just fought a world war found itself operating under the supervision of foreign bankers, who dictated how German tax revenues could be spent. This wasn't a new invention. The exact same system had been imposed on the Ottoman Empire. In 1875, when it defaulted on debts to European banks, foreign creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which took control of tax collection and government revenues. The Ottomans remained nominally independent, but their finances were run by their creditors. Now the same model was being applied to Germany, a major industrial power in the heart of Europe. The Young Plan of 1929 restructured the arrangement again. It reduced the total reparations amount but extended payments until 1988. Think about that timeline. Children born in 1929 would spend their entire working lives, from age 20 to retirement, making payments on a war that ended before they existed. 59 years of guaranteed debt payments flowing from German workers to international creditors. But the Young Plan also created something new and ominous: the Bank for International Settlements, established in Basel, Switzerland in 1930. The BIS was sold to the public as a neutral institution to manage reparations payments. In reality, it became the central bank for central banks, an institution operating above national laws, where the world's financial elite could coordinate policy beyond democratic oversight. The BIS board included representatives from the German Reichsbank, the Bank of England, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and major European central banks. Its transactions weren't subject to government oversight. Its meetings were secret. Its records were privileged. The BIS could move money between nations in ways that were invisible to the public and to most government officials. It was the perfect vehicle for coordinating financial policy across borders and across sides of future conflicts. Between 1924 and 1931, over $475 million flowed from American banks into Germany. In today's money, that's roughly $8 billion. Germany paid about $19 billion in reparations during the same period, so on the surface, Germany was paying out more than it was borrowing. But that wasn't the point. The point was establishing legal and institutional frameworks for permanent financial control. As long as the loans kept flowing and reparations kept getting paid, the system worked. The problem was what would happen when the loans stopped, and in October 1929 they did. When the American stock market crashed, the flow of American loans to Germany dried up almost overnight. Remember, the entire reparation system depended on American banks lending Germany money to make payments. When those loans stopped, Germany couldn't pay reparations. When Germany couldn't pay, Britain and France couldn't pay their debts to America. The circular debt machine stopped and everyone was exposed. For ordinary Germans, the result was economic catastrophe. Unemployment exploded from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. That's nearly a five-fold increase in 3 years. Industrial production collapsed. The banking system teetered on total failure. Millions of Germans who had jobs, savings, and stability in 1928 were destitute by 1932. The Weimar government, already despised for signing the Versailles Treaty, became associated with economic apocalypse in the minds of ordinary citizens. But this wasn't accidental. The debt structure created at Versailles had made Germany uniquely vulnerable to external shocks. The economy had been rebuilt on American loans, not internal capacity. When those loans stopped, there was no cushion, no domestic base to fall back on. Germany had been intentionally structured to be dependent. So what does this economic collapse mean for the banks that had loaned billions to Germany? American and British banks that held German debt were facing their own crisis. They had loaned billions to German corporations, German banks, and the German government. If Germany completely collapsed, those loans would default, creating massive losses for institutions already struggling from the 1929 crash. The banks needed Germany stable enough to keep making payments, but not so stable that it could challenge the debt arrangements or refuse to pay. This is where Adolf Hitler enters the story. In 1930, the Nazi Party was a marginal extremist movement. By January 1933, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. How does a fringe party take control of a major industrial nation in just 3 years? The usual explanation focuses on Hitler's charisma, German resentment over Versailles, and economic desperation. All of that is true, but it misses the financial mechanism that enabled Hitler's rise. Starting in 1930, German industrial corporations began funding the Nazi Party in substantial amounts. This wasn't scattered donations. Farben, the chemical giant, Krupp, the steel and armaments manufacturer, and Thyssen, the coal and steel baron. But here's the key question. Where were these corporations getting money to fund political parties during an economic depression when millions were unemployed and credit had collapsed? They were getting it from American loans and investments that continued flowing to specific industrial sectors even while general lending dried up. And the channel for those flows was the Bank for International Settlements. The BIS, created in 1930 to manage reparations, could move money between countries. The BIS operated above national law. Its transactions were privileged. It could facilitate financial flows that were completely invisible to the public. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, you might expect American banks to cut off credit to Nazi Germany. The opposite happened. American investment in Germany increased dramatically between 1933 and 1939. Why would American financial institutions lend money to a fascist regime led by a man openly threatening war? The answer is cold financial calculation. Hitler promised to restore order, suppress labor unions, and most importantly, honor Germany's international debts. For American creditors, Hitler was a better option than a communist Germany or a collapsed Germany that couldn't pay anything. The scale of American corporate involvement with Nazi Germany is staggering when you look at actual records. IBM, through its German subsidiary Dehomag, provided the punch card technology that enabled the Nazis to conduct census operations and organizational systems that were later used to coordinate the Holocaust. IBM President Thomas Watson received the Merit Cross of the German Eagle from Hitler in 1937 and maintained business relationships with the Nazi government. Throughout the 1930s, General Motors, through its German subsidiary Opel, became integral to Nazi military rearmament. By 1938, Opel was producing trucks for the Wehrmacht. Ford Motor Company's German operations similarly tooled up for military production. Henry Ford was awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle in 1938, the highest honor Nazi Germany could bestow on a foreigner. Farben, the German chemical conglomerate that later produced Zyklon B used in concentration camp gas chambers. Farben, technology that proved crucial for Germany's ability to wage war despite limited access to natural rubber and petroleum. These business relationships weren't incidental to Nazi rearmament. They were essential to it. Germany's industrial base had been devastated by World War I, the reparations burden, and the Depression. The rapid rebuild of German military capacity between 1933 and 1939 required capital, technology, and industrial equipment. A huge portion came from American corporations. But the really explosive evidence comes from the banking sector. Bush was a director and partner at Brown Brothers Harriman, which had extensive financial relationships with German industrial companies, including Fritz Thyssen, one of Hitler's earliest and most important financial backers. These weren't minor business dealings. These were fundamental financial relationships that enabled the Nazi war machine. And they weren't secret. They were documented in corporate records, board minutes, and government files. The connections were known. They were allowed to continue because they served the interests of creditors who needed Germany strong enough to generate revenue. Morgan's commercial banking arm continued operating its Paris branch after Germany occupied France in 1940. Chase. Paris froze the accounts of Jewish clients and sold their assets, collaborating directly with Nazi seizure of Jewish property. This wasn't done under duress. This was voluntary cooperation with Nazi policies in order to maintain banking relationships and profits. These actions were documented in internal bank records, but didn't result in any consequences for executives after the war. And then there's the Bank for International Settlements, which continued functioning throughout World War II as a financial clearinghouse that included both Allied and Axis central banks. The BIS facilitated the transfer of Nazi gold, including gold looted from Holocaust victims, and from the central banks of conquered nations. The BIS converted this gold to currency that Germany could use in international transactions. In March 1939, when Germany seized Czechoslovakia, the BIS transferred 23 tons of gold that had been held on behalf of Czechoslovakia directly to the German Reichsbank. This was Czech national gold, seized through conquest, laundered through an international institution, and converted into currency Germany used to fund further military operations. American and British board members of the BIS continued attending meetings in neutral Switzerland throughout the war, sitting at the same table as their German and Italian counterparts, coordinating financial arrangements between nations actively trying to kill each other's soldiers. By the end of the war, 82% of the BIS's income came from interest payments from the Reichsbank, initially in currency, but from 1940 onwards entirely in gold. When this was exposed after the war, no one was prosecuted. The BIS was too important to the international financial system to be disrupted by questions about its role in facilitating Nazi operations. So what does all of this mean for the outbreak of World War II itself? By 1939, Germany owed massive debts to American banks and corporations. But Germany also held debts from Eastern European countries that had borrowed from German banks during the 1920s. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and other nations in Germany's sphere had taken loans during the Dawes and Young Plan era. Those debts were still outstanding. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the military action had a financial dimension that's almost never discussed. German conquest of Eastern Europe meant German control over those nations' resources and the ability to extract payment on pre-existing debts. The standard historical narrative presents Hitler's aggression as ideologically driven by racial theories and desire for Lebensraum, living space. That's partially true, but it misses the economic logic that made aggression financially rational from the perspective of Germany's international creditors. If Germany conquered resource-rich territory, it could generate revenue needed to pay its debts to American banks. If Germany collapsed economically, those loans would default and creditors would lose billions. Military expansion was actually the solution that best served the interests of Germany's international creditors. A weak Germany couldn't pay. A strong Germany that controlled the resources of Eastern Europe could loot enough wealth to service its obligations. This explains something that otherwise makes no sense. Why did American banks continue extending credit to Nazi Germany? Even as Hitler's aggressive intentions became obvious, why did American corporations continue supplying German military buildup throughout the 1930s? The answer is that creditors had a financial interest in Germany becoming powerful enough to extract wealth from its neighbors. The scale of plunder from occupied territories was enormous and directly connected to debt service. When Germany occupied France, the German government imposed occupation costs that required France to pay for its own occupation. French payments alone totaled over 860 million marks annually, far more than the actual cost of maintaining German occupation forces. The surplus didn't improve conditions in France. It flowed to Berlin to service Germany's international debts and fund further military operations. But the real financial transformation came with American entry into the war in December 1941. Just as in World War I, American participation fundamentally changed the debt dynamics. The United States began extending massive loans to Britain and other allies through the Lend-Lease program. By the war's end, Lend-Lease aid totaled over $50 billion, equivalent to roughly $700 billion today. Britain, which had entered the war as a creditor nation with an empire spanning the globe, emerged as the world's largest debtor, owing the United States amounts that would take decades to repay. The pattern from World War I repeated exactly. A European conflict created emergency borrowing needs. That allowed American financial institutions to establish dominant creditor positions over nations that had previously been economic rivals. Every artillery shell fired, every tank produced, every bomber sent into the sky represented loan obligations that would outlast the military conflict by generations. The longer the war lasted, the more Europe borrowed from America. The more Europe borrowed, the more dominant America's financial position became. But if World War II was really about debt collection, what was the endgame? How did creditors plan to restructure the post-war world to lock in their control? In July 1944, with the war still raging, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The stated purpose was to establish a new international monetary system to prevent future conflicts. The actual purpose was to formalize American financial dominance over the post-war world. Dollar as the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. International trade would be conducted in dollars. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, would manage international loans and development aid, with voting rights proportional to financial contributions, ensuring American control. Think about what this meant in practical terms. The United States emerged from World War II holding the majority of the world's gold reserves, controlling the world's reserve currency, and serving as the primary creditor for reconstruction. Europe and Japan, devastated by war, would need to borrow from American institutions to rebuild. Those loans would be denominated in dollars, creating permanent demand for American currency. The dollar's role as reserve currency meant the United States could print money to pay for imports, while other nations had to earn dollars through exports. America had achieved through World War II what Britain had lost through World War I, the ability to extract wealth from the global economy through control of the monetary system. The war hadn't just defeated Germany and Japan militarily. It had reset the entire global financial hierarchy with American banks at the top. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, extended $13 billion in aid to Western Europe for reconstruction. This is typically presented as American generosity helping former enemies rebuild. But the Marshall Plan was structured as loans, not grants, though the terms were more favorable than commercial rates. European nations that accepted Marshall Plan aid also agreed to open their markets to American goods, provide preferential treatment to American investors, and align their foreign policies with American interests. The aid came with strings that established American economic dominance over Western Europe for decades. But here's what really reveals the financial nature of the post-war order. Germany, the defeated aggressor whose debts had helped cause 2 world wars, was divided into occupation zones, but subjected to reparations far less onerous than those imposed at Versailles. Why? Because American policymakers had learned that crushing Germany with unpayable debts created instability that threatened American investments. Instead, West Germany received Marshall Plan aid. Its debts were restructured on manageable terms. It was rebuilt as an industrial power integrated into the American-led economic system. East Germany, under Soviet control, was systematically looted and remained economically devastated for decades. The contrast was deliberate. West Germany's recovery demonstrated the benefits of cooperation with American creditors. East Germany's suffering demonstrated the costs of opting out. And the Bank for International Settlements, which had facilitated Nazi gold transactions throughout the war. It continued operating after 1945 with minimal interruption. No one was prosecuted for its wartime activities. The institution was too useful. It provided a venue for central bank cooperation that operated above national laws and beyond democratic accountability. The BIS still exists today, still headquartered in Basel, still conducting meetings and transactions that aren't subject to public oversight. The final reckoning of World War II debt took decades. Britain did not finish paying its Lend-Lease obligations to the United States until 2006, more than 60 years after the war ended. Germany's final reparations payment for World War I was made in 2010, 92 years after the armistice. But Germany's World War II debts were largely forgiven or restructured, not because of moral considerations, but because creditors had learned that manageable debt was more profitable than unpayable debt. A debtor who can pay indefinitely is more valuable than a debtor who collapses and defaults. So if this pattern worked so perfectly, has it been used again? The Cold War that followed World War II was presented as an ideological conflict between capitalism and communism, democracy and totalitarianism. That's the surface explanation. The financial reality was that the Soviet Union represented an alternative economic system that didn't rely on dollar-denominated debt and American financial institutions. The entire Soviet bloc opted out of Bretton Woods, the IMF, the World Bank, and the debt-based system that American banks controlled. The Cold War arms race served the same function as World Wars I and II. It created borrowing needs that established long-term financial obligations. The United States borrowed trillions to build nuclear weapons, maintain military bases worldwide, and fund proxy wars. The Soviet Union borrowed billions from Western banks to purchase technology and grain, creating debt dependencies that ultimately contributed to its collapse. When the USSR finally fell in 1991, it wasn't conquered militarily. It went bankrupt. The Soviet system couldn't sustain the debt burden of trying to match American military spending. The 2008 financial crisis provides an even clearer example. Reckless lending by major banks created a global economic collapse. The response was trillion-dollar bailouts funded by taxpayer debt. The banks that created the crisis received government money to cover their losses. Taxpayers received the debt, and the banks emerged from the crisis more powerful and more profitable than before. The crisis was caused by bad loans. The solution was more debt, with banks as creditors and ordinary citizens as debtors. The specific institutions that profited from World War II still dominate global finance today. Morgan & Company, that financed both world wars, is the largest bank in America with over $3 trillion in assets. Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, all with roots in wartime finance, control trillions more. The international monetary system still revolves around dollar dominance established at Bretton Woods. The IMF and World Bank still impose austerity policies on debtor nations that prioritize creditor repayment over human welfare. Senator. His son became president. His grandson became president. The banking and corporate executives who profited from Nazi Germany face no prosecutions and no consequences. The institutions that facilitated Hitler's rise and profited from the war remain the dominant forces in global finance today. This wasn't failure. This wasn't unfortunate coincidence. This was success. The system worked exactly as intended. Wars create debt. Debt creates control. Control creates profit. The cycle repeats because it's profitable for the people who control the system. When you understand this pattern, modern events make more sense. Why do international conflicts consistently benefit the largest financial institutions? Why do emergency situations always result in increased government debt rather than decreased international tensions? Why do peace agreements always involve complex financial arrangements that seem more important than the territorial or political terms? The answer is that wars aren't primarily fought over ideology, territory, or political disputes. They're fought to establish and maintain the debt-based financial system that benefits creditors regardless of which side wins the military conflict. Every bullet fired, every city destroyed, every life lost generates interest payments flowing to the banks that created the financial conditions making war more profitable than peace. World War II didn't happen because Hitler was evil, though he certainly was. It happened because unpaid World War I debts created a mathematical impossibility that could only be resolved through another massive conflict that would reset debt relationships and establish new financial hierarchies. The 50 million deaths weren't a tragedy that interrupted the financial system. They were the mechanism through which the system operated. We're not living in a world shaped by the military outcomes of historical wars. We're living in a world shaped by the financial arrangements that funded those wars. More than any battlefield victory, more than any ideological triumph, more than any political settlement, that financial architecture explains why our current international system prioritizes debt service over human welfare, creditor rights over national sovereignty, and bank profits over democratic governance. And if you think this pattern is ancient history, look at current geopolitical tensions through this lens. China competition isn't primarily about ideology or human rights. It's about which nation will control the international financial system. The United States has used dollar dominance to impose financial sanctions more effective than military force. The next major conflict, whether economic or military, will reshape global debt relationships the same way World Wars I and II did. The question isn't whether this pattern exists. The documentary evidence is overwhelming. The question is what you do with this knowledge. Because once you see how the system actually works, you can't unsee it. Every news story about international tensions, every crisis that requires emergency borrowing, every war that's explained through ideology suddenly looks different when you ask the simplest question: who profits from the debt this will create? The bankers who triggered World War II collected their debts through 50 million deaths. They faced no consequences. They grew more powerful. And the system they perfected is still operating today, waiting for the next crisis, to create the next opportunity for debt-based control. If this gave you a new lens on what's actually happening beneath the surface of history, subscribe, because the answers are rarely in the headlines. They're buried in the financial flows and institutional arrangements that most people never think to examine. And understanding those flows is the only way to see the pattern before it repeats again.